We've covered in this channel how to build web applications with Django and FastAPI, but in this video we're going to look at something a bit different, and that's how to build desktop applications using Python. And specifically for the desktop apps, we're going to use the PyQt6 package. And PyQt6 is a Python binding for the Qt toolkit for building desktop applications. So we're going to create a very small application that shows some of the widgets that are available in PyQt6 and also how we can interact with those widgets and respond to events. This is going to be a very introductory video though. In the next video that I'm planning, we can show how to integrate PyQt6 with a database to pull data from that database and also to update the database when the user submits some data. But before we show that, I want to show this introduction so that we can get an overview of PyQt's core concepts. Now before we get started, if you're enjoying this content and you want to support the channel, we have this Ko-fi page linked in the description, and any donations here are greatly appreciated. Thanks very much to everyone who has donated so far. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this content. So let's get started. We're going to look at an introduction to Qt. Now what this does is it allows you to develop applications with nice and intuitive user interfaces, but importantly this is for multiple devices and platforms. So Qt is cross-platform as it says here, and that means that Qt-based user interfaces are going to work on Windows, macOS and Linux. Now what we're going to do in this video is we're going to start with a quick look at this reference guide, and this is the official documentation for PyQt version 6. And I'll leave a link to this below the video, but this is quite a difficult documentation to parse in my opinion. There is an excellent alternative website that you can use called pythonguis.com. So if you want to create a GUI application with Python, this is an excellent website, and they offer some very good books introducing some patterns for this package as well. And I would highly recommend that you check those out if you're interested in building desktop applications with Python. This is not affiliated or anything, but I'll leave a link in the description of the video. Now, if you're building desktop apps with Python using the Qt framework, there are different packages or libraries that you might want to use. For example, PyQt6 and PyQt6, these are basically identical in terms of the APIs that are used. So if you learn one of them, you're going to be able to learn the other one. And that's because the bindings are named after the code that's in the underlying C++ package. So they have a very similar API, but we're going to focus on PyQt6 in this video. So let's click that just now. Now I'm going to make this text a little bit bigger. So what we're going to do here is start with this overview. Now let's scroll down here to the Where Do I Begin section. And in fact, I think the best thing to do is just go to this PyQt6 tutorial. And we're going to work through this tutorial, and we're also going to adapt it to show some extra steps. So as mentioned before, PyQt is a Python library for creating GUI applications using the Qt toolkit. And it was created by Riverbank Computing. Now what we're going to do is go down here to the Getting Started section, and we're going to go to this section here on creating our first application with PyQt6. And this will be a simple Hello World application, but we're going to extend it throughout the video. So if we look at the section on creating an application, what you do is you create a new Python file to start with. So for a very simple application, very simple user interface, you might only have a single Python file, and you can call that whatever you want. And this has called it app.py, and I'm going to follow that convention. So if we go to VS Code, we have an app.py file, and currently that file is empty. Now if we go back here, what we're going to do is we're going to look at these imports at the top, and we're going to copy these and bring them into our application. So I'm going to paste these in here, and I'm going to fix the reference to the Python virtual environment, and that's just so that these underlines go away. So at the bottom here, I've got a Python virtual environment activated, and I'm going to run a command here, and that's the pip install command. And we're going to install PyQt6. So version 6 is the version that we want to use here. It's the most up-to-date version at the time of recording. And then if I go to the interpreter that's being used for Python here, I'm going to change that. And in fact, I need to click this here and enter the interpreter path. So I'm going to enter that and fix the link to this virtual environment. And once we've done that, you can see that the warning has disappeared from this import. We still have the underlines here, and that's just because we're not currently using these objects that we're importing, and this is using the rough formatter here in VS Code for those warnings. So in order to create an application, what we do is instantiate this QApplication object. So I'm going to create a variable here called app, and we're going to instantiate that, and we're going to pass in an empty list. Let's go back to the documentation, and we're going to see why we're doing this. So the QApplication represents this PyQt application, and you only need one of these per application. And what that takes as an argument is the parameters that are passed into the script from the command line. So if you pass any of those in, you can use sys.argv, which is a list in Python, to accept those arguments. but you can also pass an empty list if you're not passing anything in, and that's what we're going to do here, and that's why we have an empty list. Now once we have an application object, you can create any number of widgets and add them to that app. So let's go back to the documentation, and we're going to copy the code that's listed here. So I'm going to bring that into VS Code, and we're going to see what happens here. So we're instantiating a QWidget, and that is going to represent our window as this comment says. So the PyQt application is going to be composed of windows, and these will appear on the screen on your desktop, and you can then interact with those windows. And importantly, you need to call window.show, and that's because all windows are going to be hidden by default. I'm going to remove this comment, and then the final line of code here is going to start the PyQt event loop. So PyQt has an event loop that is going to listen for events that occur in the user interface, as we're going to see throughout this video. If you've not encountered an event loop before, it's quite similar to just an infinite loop that's always listening while your application is running. And because user interfaces are an event-driven environment, you need something that's going to be able to listen and respond to events. Now you can think of other event-driven environments such as video games. They need to be constantly listening for user input, and also server environments as well. For example, you might have heard of the Node.js event loop, and that allows JavaScript code to be executed on the server, even though JavaScript is a single-threaded programming language. So to start the event loop, we call the exec function on the application object that we get back from QApplication. And then we can actually run this and see if it works. So I'm going to clear the terminal and let's run Python. And the name of our file is app.py. And when we run that, you can see we have a window appearing here. Nothing interesting, there's nothing on the window at the moment, but we can customize this as we wish. For example, at the top, it just says Python. We can give the window a title here. So just before we call window.show, I'm going to call a method called setWindow, and we get some options here. If I go down to the bottom, it's setWindowTitle, and I'm going to pass in a string here of amazing PyQt app, and we can then rerun app.py, and you see that title at the top of the window. And we can also set coordinates about where we want the window to appear on the screen, and also the width and height of the window. So we can do that using another method, and that's the setGeometry method. And the first two arguments here are the X and Y coordinates where the window will be placed. So let's just pass 50 and 50 here. And then we have the width and the height. So I'm going to pass 800 by 600 here. And again, if we save this and run Python app.py, this has actually appeared on my left-hand monitor here. But if I drag it onto the page here, you can see the window. And what I'm going to do is increase the width so it should be longer. And I'm going to decrease the height. So let's close this and let's increase the width to 1800. And we're going to make the height only 200 pixels. When we execute app.py again, I'm going to drag this onto the page and you can see that effect here. So we can very easily set the default width and height of our window, and also the default starting position as X and Y coordinates. Now before we move on, I want to go back to the documentation, and let's go down here just below this code. We've seen how to run app.py, and we've got an understanding about what each of these objects is doing. So let's now have a very quick look at the event loop. Now at the core of every Qt application is this QApplication class that we instantiated. And every PyQt application only needs a single QApplication object to function. And it's that object that's going to hold the event loop of your application. And that's the core loop that's going to govern all user interaction with the GUI. And we've got a diagram below, so let's have a look at that just now. You can see the event loop here is periodically collecting events from an event queue that PyQt has. And then when it collects those events from the event queue, it's going to run the event handler, and then there will be some further actions. So what happens when the user interacts with the user interface is that events are added to this internal event queue that PyQt has, and then the event loop is constantly checking that queue, and it's going to pull events off the queue when it finds them there. So an example of an event is when you press a key in the application, or when you click the mouse, for example, over a button. These are all events, and each one of these will be placed in that event queue above, and the event loop is going to check the queue on each iteration of the loop. And if it finds an event, then that event and control is going to be passed to the event handler for that event. So we only need one running event loop per PyQt application, and that event loop is stored on the QApplication class. Now what I want to do just now is I'm going to come back to this section on QMainWindow a bit later in the video, but let's now add some of our own widgets to this application. So let's go back to VS Code just now, and what I'm going to do is add a couple of extra widgets. So PyQt has some core modules, and the QWidgets is one of the core modules that provides a set of user interface widgets. I'm going to import a couple more of these, and it's going to be QLabel and QPushButton. Now the label allows you to add text, and optionally you can actually format that text with HTML, and that's what we're going to do to start with. So let's go under these sections on setting the geometry and the title, and we're going to create a variable here called label, and I'm going to set that equal to a QLabel. And I'm going to pass a bit of HTML formatted text in here. So let me paste that in just now. So we've got a string and it's an h1 tag in HTML with the header message that this is an informative text message. And what we can also do when we pass that in is we can pass the parent, and that's important because when you create these widgets in PyQt6, they form a hierarchy. So you have a parent widget, and then that might have children, and the child widgets themselves can also have further children. So the parent is the window itself, and we instantiated that on line 6. That was the QWidget instance. We're passing that now as the parent. And we're going to do something quite similar for the QPushButton that we imported as well. So just on the line below here, let's create a button variable and instantiate QPushButton. And that text that we're going to add to the button, let's just say click here. And again, I'm going to assign the parent as that window. So we've added two widgets here that are children of our window. What we're going to do now is expand the terminal, and again, let's just run python app.py, and I'm going to bring that back onto the page here. And you can see we now have our header. This is an informative text message, and we also have the button. Now they're stacking on top of each other. So by default, it's going to place all of the widgets at the top left of this application, of this window. So what we can do to change that, for example, is we can move the button. So I'm going to take this button here and I'm going to call a .move function on that, a .move method. And we can move this to a specific location. So I'm going to move that 0 pixels from the left-hand side. In other words, we want to keep it against the left-hand edge, but I want to move it 50 pixels down from the top. So if we add that code there and re-execute the script, we're going to see, if I bring this back onto the screen, that now the button has been moved down 50 pixels from the top. Now this works okay, but it's not the most robust way of organizing the widgets in a user interface. It's better to use something called layouts in PyQt6, and we're going to see that just now. So I'm going to go to the documentation, and on the Python GUI's website, we have a page dedicated to these layouts. So what we can see in the table of contents are some of the different layouts that are available. For example, we have a QVBox layout and an HBox layout as well for vertically and horizontally arranging a set of widgets. We can also nest layouts together, and we can use a grid layout if you want to organize things in a grid. And you can think of that as being similar to the CSS grid if you're familiar with web programming. And finally, we also have a QStacked layout as well if you need multiple widgets to occupy the same space. Now, to keep things simple, if we look at the application we've got here, we want to arrange these from top to bottom. So we're going to do this vertically. So the one I want to use here is the QVBox layout. So let's go down here to the section on the VBox layout. And what we need to do is create the layout, and then we create a set of widgets and add them to that layout using the add widget method. So let's see how to do this in our simple script at the moment. Later on, we're going to move things into a class. Now, if we go to the top from the QTWidgets module, we can import the QVBox layout. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create an instance of that layout. So I'm going to do that just down here below the window calls. And we're going to create a layout variable, and we're going to instantiate the QVBox layout. And I'm going to pass the window into that. And again, because it's a widget class, you can pass a parent, and in this case the parent is going to be the window itself. We then have our label and our button, and we have the button.move method. I'm actually going to remove this because this is going to be a different way of approaching how to structure widgets on a page, on a window. And then just below these, we're going to call layout.addWidget, and we're going to pass the label in, and we're also going to copy that to the line below, and we're going to pass the button in as well. Now I'm going to save this, and on the terminal at the bottom, we can run python app.py. And if we bring the window onto the screen, you can see the user interface now, and it does look slightly different. We have the header right in the center here, and then the button at the bottom, and you can see that button is taking up the full width of this window. Now what I'm going to do is just remove this call here to set geometry. We don't actually need this to show things, but you can set the geometry explicitly. And if we rerun this now, you can see that things are arranged top to bottom, and the window takes up exactly the width and height required for this content. Now you can customize the width of these. For example, you might not want the button to be quite as wide as this. That can be done as well using PyQt6. And if we wanted to add a further widget to this, what we could do is we could do that as well. So at the top, let's import the Q slider, and that's going to give us a slider that we can use. And then just below here where we create the label and the button, I'm also going to create a slider here and instantiate the QSlider. And we can also set the minimum and maximum boundaries of the slider. So for example, from 0 to 3000. And then finally, if we copy the add widget call, we can add the slider to our layout. And then if we rerun app.py, you can see we now get this this vertical slider appearing just below the button. So that's how we can add a number of different widgets. Let's just remove the slider. That was just to show how the VBox layout, you can add as many widgets as you want, and it's going to add them vertically in that layout. And finally, let's remove the import. Now I want to move on, and we're going to show how to respond to events in this application. Now, as I mentioned, when you develop user interfaces, these are event-driven applications. One example here is when we click the button, that's an event, and we might want some kind of action to occur when we actually click that button. And we don't know when the user is going to click the button or do any event in the application. And that's why we need the event loop, and we need some kind of constant monitoring of what's going on in the user interface. Now, events in PyQt, they're referred to as signals. And the action that's performed when the signal occurs, that's called the slot in PyQt6. You can think of that as being similar to a callback function in web programming. Now again, the python-guis.com website has a very useful page on these signals and slots and also events in general. I would highly recommend checking this page out. There's a link in the description, and if you're wanting to further your knowledge, these books at the top, I would recommend checking them out as well. So what we're going to do is just have a very brief look at these kind of signals and slots. So let's click this link in the table of contents here, and that seems to have just taken us back to the top. So let's just scroll down. What we're going to do is look at signals and slots. So signals are the notifications that are emitted by widgets when something happens. And that could be pressing a button or text appearing in an input box and so on. So when something happens, signals can also send data to give additional context about what happened. And finally, slots, they're the name that Qt uses for the receivers of signals. And that is any Python function or method in your application. They can be used as a slot to respond to the signal. Now the way this works, if we look at the code, is let's scroll down here. In this example, in the class, they have a button here. And that button is a QPush button, and we already have one of those in our application. What we can do is we can pass the name of the signal or the event, and in this case it's a clicked event, and then we can connect that to some kind of callable in Python, some kind of function or method. In this case, they're using a method, and it's the one at the bottom here called the button was clicked. So basically you take the signal and then you connect it to the slot or the callback function that performs the action that you want when that event occurs in your application. So let's see an example of that just now. If we go back to VS Code, and what we're going to do here is we're going to look at the button here, and I'm going to add a callback here. So on the clicked event, what we're going to do is connect a function to this, and I'm going to use a lambda function that takes no arguments. Now when this event occurs, when we click the button that you see in the user interface here, what I want to do is just change the text that appears in the label above. So we're going to take this label here, and that has a method called setText that allows you to set the text in that label. And like before, because it's a QLabel instance, we can pass an HTML formatted text here. So we're going to pass another header1, and we're going to say, yo, the button was clicked. So let's save app.py, and we're going to restart the application now. And we're going to see on the user interface this time, when we click the button, you can see that the label text has been changed when we click that button. And this can be any kind of function or callable in Python. So what I'm going to do now is just go to the top here underneath where we create the application. This is not where you would put a method like this in a real application, but we can actually put this anywhere for this demo. I'm going to create a function in Python called button clicked. And then within that function, we can set the text of the label. So I'm going to copy this line of code that we had here, and we're going to set the label text. And if your logic is more complex than a single line, you can create a function rather than a lambda function. And then let's say the button itself, we're going to set the text within that button to thanks for clicking. So now we have a slightly more complex action, not much more complex to be honest, but we now are setting the text on the label and the button using a Python function. And then when we have this click event here, we can just pass the name of that function as the slot, and that's going to then call this function whenever the button is clicked. Let's try this again. We're going to run app.py, and this time not only is the header going to change text, but we also expect the button itself to change. So let's click this button, and you can see that they're both changed. Now there's a lot you can do with events and with callbacks and slots. This is super basic, we're just changing some text, but you can imagine that, for example, when you submit a form, you want that data to be stored on some kind of local database. So your slot function or your callback function is going to then reach out to that database and store that data. So that's one example of something more complex that you might want to do. If you're interested in more examples using databases and perhaps using data science packages in Python, let me know in the comments if you want to see more with PyQt6. Now I want to go back to the QMainWindow that was covered here in this guide, and this was in the main creating your first application guide. So what we can do is we can create any widget, and any widget in PyQt can be a window. So for example, we could replace the Qt widget with the Q push button. If we go back to VS Code here, our top Q widget here, we can replace that with a button, but that's maybe not an ideal structure in terms of an application. So what's suggested here is that we use the QMainWindow. And this is a pre-made widget that provides a lot of standard window features that you'll make use of in your apps, including toolbars, menus, status bars, dockable widgets, and more. And you can see below that when we create the window, this time it's using QMainWindow instead. And if we go down further, you can also create classes here and subclass QMainWindow. And that is neat because it allows you to consolidate code for the actual window. So for example, window behavior code, that can all be self-contained in the _init method on this class. Now I want to show an example of this at the end of the video, and one of the good things about doing this is that behavior such as your slot methods, they can actually be methods on the class, so you're kind of consolidating all of that in the right place. So let's just show an example of that now, and there are quite a few things that we're going to need to change here. So what I'm going to do at the very top here is create a class, and I'm going to call this MainWindow. And that's going to be a subclass of this QMainWindow. So let's import QMainWindow from the widgets module, and we're going to subclass that here and create our own class. And then we create a _init method. And in that _init method, we can first of all call the superclasses _init method, and that's going to call that on the QMainWindow itself. So that's taking advantage of that inheritance in Python. And then we can, for example, set the window title with self.setWindowTitle. And we can pass the text that we had below here, 𝗵𝗽𝗍𝗵𝗽, into that method. Now what I'm going to do is just remove this because we've added it, and I'm going to gradually build this user interface up using the class. So after we set the window title, I want to grab this layout that we have here, and I want to bring that into the _init method because within this window, we want things laid out from top to bottom in a vertical layout. So we're going to create a layout variable here, and we no longer need to pass the window into that. After we've got the layout, I'm going to bring all of these widgets that we have here. Let's first of all delete the layout, but I'm going to bring these two widgets that we have into the class, and I'm going to set class variables here. So let me fix the indentation, and let's set these on the class. So we can do that by setting self.label and also self.button. And again, because this is on the class constructor as well, we can remove the parent from these widgets. So all we're doing here is we're setting up a QLabel and a QPushButton, and we're getting them back and we're storing them on the class self.label and self.button. So our window object, this class, now has a reference to these that we can use in methods and other parts of the class. And we're also going to take the signal and the slot behavior of this button, and that was this code here. I'm going to cut that out, and we're going to bring that into the constructor as well. And remember, we need to reference the button as self.button here. And the connect method that we're calling is still this button clicked method, but I'm going to bring that into the class as a method. So instead of just a function that is defined in the namespace or the top namespace of the Python code, we now have a method, and to make this a method, we pass self in as the parameter. And remember, because we're referencing the label and the button on the class, these have been stored in the _init method, so we need to reference self.label and self.button within this callback. And the final thing to do, I think here, is to pass self.buttonClicked into this method. So again, we're taking the button that we're now storing on the class, we're looking at the clicked signal from PyQt, and we're connecting that to this method that we have, and that method is stored on the class itself. So again, we're consolidating all of the behavior for this window in a class, and that includes methods that are stored on the class. Now we've got a few other lines of code to add. So if we go down here, we have a couple of layout.addWidget calls. And what we're going to do here is add these to the _init method. So I'm going to paste them in here, and again, we need to fix the indentation. So we're adding the label and the button to our layout. And again, we need to pass self.label and self.button. And finally, what we can do is we can take this code here for creating a window, and we're going to move that into the under init method. And then we can call window.setLayout, and that's going to set the layout on that window, and we can pass our layout into that method. And the last step, I believe here, is to set the central widget for this class. So that's going to be self.setCentralWidget, and we can pass this window into that method. So what the self.setCentralWidget method is going to do is it's going to apply the widget that we pass in, and in our case that's the window, and that's just an instance of QWidget where we set the layout to that vertical layout that we created above. So it's going to apply that to the window, and this method is specific to the QMainWindow object. It basically allows you to set the widget that goes right in the middle of that window. Now once we've done this, we're going to go to the code below here, and I'm going to clean this up a bit now. We can get rid of window.show. What we're going to do now is we're actually going to instantiate the main window class that we've created to get back an object. So we're going to call that window, and we're going to instantiate main window here. And then as before, we need to call window.show in order for that to actually appear on the screen. Remember, windows are hidden by default. Now if we go back to the terminal here and we run python app.py, hopefully that's still going to work, and you can see that we still get the window appearing. And when we click the button, we still get that behavior from the callback function here, and that's the button clicked function. But the benefit of reorganizing this code here is that we've consolidated all of the logic and the behavior for our window into this class. And if you have multiple windows in your application, or perhaps you have multiple different sections of the application, you can take a more object-oriented approach and store things on instance variables, and also set up methods for any behavior that's relevant and specific to that window. Now we're nearly finished. I'm going to go back to the documentation here, and I'm going to scroll down just to the final section of this, just for completeness. We can set specific sizes for windows and for widgets that belong to windows, and that can be done using this QSize object. So we can import QSize from PyQt6.qt core. Let's do that just now at the top of our application. So that's another core module of PyQt6. This is the Qt core module, and QSize, that's going to allow us to set some specific sizes. Now if we go back to the window that we have at the moment, you can see that we can resize this, and when we do that, the user interface changes a bit, but we can resize it to basically whatever we want. I'm going to close this, and what we're going to do is we're going to set a specific and fixed window size. Now just below where we've set the window title, I'm going to call another method here, and that's setFixedSize. That's another method that we have on the QMainWindow, and you can see that takes a QSize instance, so we're going to pass that in with a width and a height. So let's say we wanted to restrict this to a width of 200 and a height of 100. That's how we would do that, by setting a fixed size for this window. And then if we go back to the terminal and run app.py, you can see now that we have a window that has a fixed size of 200 by 100. So that's not ideal. We can extend the width of this, let's say to 400. And if we rerun app.py at the bottom, you can see that it's still a little bit too small. So let me change that one more time to 500 and rerun app.py. Now one thing to note here is that we have this window, but because we've set a fixed size, we can no longer resize this window. So if you want to constrain the window to a specific size, you can use the setFixedSize method and pass a QSize into that. And there are also methods for setting a fixed minimum and a fixed maximum window size too, if you want to allow some flexibility but not go beyond certain boundaries. So that's all for this video. We've learned the basics of PyQt6 in this video. We've seen how to create a QApplication object for our PyQt6 application, and we saw how to create different widgets such as the QWidget, the QLabel, the QPushButton, the QMainWindow, and also the QSlider. It's a lot of times to say Q in a sentence. And we also briefly saw layouts, for example the QVBox layout for vertically aligned layouts. And we saw how to organize code in an object-oriented manner by subclassing QMainWindow and storing some code in instance variables and creating methods for behavior. And finally, we saw some signals such as the clicked event and the slots that are used to respond to those events. And we briefly touched upon the event loop that's intrinsic to PyQt6. So that's all for this video. I'm planning to make another video on PyQt6. If you're interested, leave a comment. And if you have any ideas for that video, please leave a comment about that as well. And if you've enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Ko-fi page in the description. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.